Look, it's 7:31, so we'll get going. And if anyone misses the start, that will be okay. They can get it later. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our second free webinar that we've started in our new series. My name is Carli Saw. I'm the Director of Strawberry Seed Consulting. I'm joined today by Tania White, who is the Managing Director and Principal Lawyer of Across the T. Tanya is someone that we work closely with sometimes and send clients to because she covers things we don't. So it's always nice to have other businesses that you can direct people to when you're not able to help. So without further ado, I might start, now that my thing is working, by just introducing Strawberry Seed Consulting. For those that are new to us, we are a HR consulting business. And we work predominantly with small business right around the country. We work with a multitude of industries, and we really focus on helping small businesses with their HR needs. The analogy that I often use is your accountant sets up your financial systems and gives you financial advice. We just give you people systems and people advice. So here's a few pictures of my team, which is constantly growing. You'll see there's a baby there. I don't think we've had a team meeting without a baby within it for a very, very long time. And down the bottom there, you'll see our office mascot, Steve the Strawberry. He is a very valued member of our team. He's there if you want to hug, he's there if you want to punch something. He never says anything, and we think he's the ideal man.
I agree. I need a strawberry as well, Carli.
He sits up on the shelf and he's fantastic. So today we're really here to talk about employees versus contractors, and it is something that certainly within our business we talk about almost daily, because a lot of people get confused and think that they're interchangeable, but they're really not. They're two completely different forms of engagement, and you know, they are applicable in different situations. So that's why we wanted to do this one today, and that's why I invited Tanya to come along with us. And so she's going to go through contracting, and then I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more about employment. But I'm going to hand over to Tanya and get her to introduce herself, and then go through some more detailed information about contracting.
Thank you, Carli, and hello everyone. The picture on screen, I was having a significantly better hair day than I am today, but isn't that life at the moment post-COVID? So I'm Tania White. I'm a commercial lawyer. I've been practicing for about 16, 17 years now. And what my business, Cross the T, does is work with small and medium-sized businesses to essentially address their business law needs. I try and work with them and get to know them and their business really well so that I can help guide them, and so that whilst they're navigating the minefields that is being in business, that they're avoiding any of the traps, which, as Carli has noted, one of the biggest traps, one of the biggest hurdles for business owners is that which we encounter when we're looking to hire somebody to assist us in our business. There's a couple of ways that we can do that, of course. One is we hire an employee under an employment agreement or an employment arrangement. Now, Carli will go into the ins and outs of what that might look like and the various different contracting arrangements for employment. Essentially, if you've hired someone as an employee, it's pretty easy to determine who they are. They're an employee. Where the grey area comes in is when we're hiring someone as a contractor. So in the truest sense of the word, a contractor, an independent contractor, is someone who is outside of your business. You are hiring them to assist you in your business, but they don't form part of your business in the truest sense. The distinction isn't easy though, and this is why so many businesses trip up. That's why we often hear in the headlines about significant back pay needing to be recompensed to people who should have been classified as employee instead of a contractor. If we get it wrong, we could have significant financial implications, plus some other implications as well. So it's something that all business owners, when you're ready to employ someone, hire someone, you really need to turn your mind to what is the appropriate contracting arrangement, hiring arrangement for you, for this particular arrangement based on reality. I always say this to my clients, it doesn't matter what we write in a bit of paper. Courts, Fair Work Australia, the tax office will all look beyond what's on that bit of paper, and they will look at the reality of their situation as well. So you need to be really honest with yourself and with your advisors as well, so that we make sure that we're capturing everything as it should be. And we're able to advise you in the best possible manner so that you're best placed to not only make sure that employees are getting what they deserve, but also you are protected from a future claim, essentially. Now, the distinction between employees and contractors, as I touched on, is not black and white, unfortunately. There's a whole matrix of indicators, of flags that Fair Work Australia, the ATO and the courts will look at when they're asked to determine if someone is a contractor or whether they should be more appropriately classified as an employee. I do have a couple of references in a few slides, but the ATO website and the Fair Work Australia website both have some really great resources where you can go yourself or with your advisor, and you're essentially using this interactive tool to say, I'm hiring person X, they're going to do this sort of job, they have their own ABN, I exert this level of control, whatever it might be. You're answering about a dozen questions. And at the end of that, you'll be provided with a little bit of a guidepost as to what that program considers you're doing. Are you employing someone or are you contracting an independent contractor? I think that is well worth everyone after this session or next week or on the weekend or whatever works for you, go and look at those matrices and really start to get to know the types of things that Fair Work and ATO consider important as being a distinguishing factor between the two types of hiring someone. Have a few goes, play around with it. It's not recorded anywhere. On that though, if you are going to use the matrix at the outset of your hiring someone, and I recommend that you do it, and you're going to rely on the answer from the matrix to say, well, based on the 12 answers you've given us, hiring Tanya, she's a contractor. That's great. Print your results, save your results. I'll get into why that's important in a moment, but really any of this early thinking that you're doing, perhaps you're having a chat with Carli or with someone like me, or you're calling the Fair Work yourself and just getting a little bit of guidance, take notes, keep evidence. It could be really useful in future. Next slide, please, Carli. Thank you. Okay, so why do we care if someone is an employee or a contractor? What does it matter, really? They're doing the work that we've asked them to do and they're getting paid. So what else matters? It matters because employees under Australian law, under both the National Employment Standards and various awards, employees are entitled to a range of employment entitlements. Now, Carli will go into what this includes when she's speaking in a moment, but for our purposes, it should be one of the leading factors as a business owner. Am I providing my people what they are entitled to receive? It should be one of our initial questions. If we miscategorize someone as a contractor instead of an employee, we're perhaps doing them out of some entitlements that they're otherwise entitled to. Long service leave entitlements, annual leave entitlements. It might be public holiday leave loading, any range of things that an employee would be entitled to, but as a contractor, perhaps not. You're entering an arm's length contract. So that's why it's important. If we get it wrong, it can affect our tax obligations, our obligations in paying superannuation contributions to our people, and also different obligations that might be around insurance, for example. Regardless of if we get it wrong innocently or purposely, if we are proven to have gotten it wrong, we've been treating someone as a contractor when rightly at law they're an employee, we have to back pay them their entitlements. It is what it is, full stop. What we might be able to avoid if we have tried to really turn our mind to the situation and we've innocently made a mistake. We've misinterpreted the relationship. We could potentially avoid penalties and fines. That's where we're talking about keeping your evidence, doing your thinking. It's the fines that we're hoping to avoid, not avoiding having to pay back payments. If the person you're hiring is entitled to them, they will get them, as well they should. Next slide, please, Carli. So let's assume that all of us on this call and all of us who are watching this at a future point in time, we're not dodgy. We're obviously on this call because we care and we want to get it right, and we are keen to make sure that we and our business are doing the right thing. Let's start there. So we've signed someone up as an independent contractor. Perhaps they're working for us for 6 months, a year, whatever it might be on a particular project. Down the track, that person then says, you know what, no, I think actually I should have been an employee, and they make a claim against us. Court, Fair Work, whomever it might be, will hear the matter, depending on how far we track down the adjudication process. They'll hear the matter and they will make a determination based on your documentation, so your contract, but also based on reality and the intention of the parties and the common understanding of the parties. They will make a determination, was that person really an employee? Let's just say it is determined that yes, they should have been an employee. Oops, we got it wrong. What does that mean for us as the business owner, as the hiring entity? There's a range of ramifications. One is the requirement to make up lost super that you should have been paying on your employees' behalf for that period of time that they were under your employ. Even, I will put this as a little postscript, and we'll come up again in a moment when we're talking about independent contractor agreements, but even if someone is genuinely a contractor, you may still have some obligations to make superannuation contributions on their behalf, depending on a range of factors that will turn on the particular circumstances of your hiring arrangement, how much time they dedicate to you, do they provide services to other employers, and a few other bits and bobs. So don't just assume that if it's a contracting arrangement, you don't have to pay super. It's a little bit more in depth than that, but we'll just leave that as a postscript for now. Back in the land where we've made an innocent mistake and we've accidentally classified someone as a contractor instead of employee, we've done the back payment of superannuation. Perhaps there could be some work cover insurance implications. As an employer, we're obliged to take out insurance for our employees. If it turns out that we haven't been doing that for Joe Bloggs because we assumed they were a contractor and they had their own work cover insurance, then it may be, there could be implications, and it's a little bit of a longer bow. There could be implications for back payment of insurance premiums with work cover because they should have been captured during that period of time. As I mentioned earlier, there's an obligation to make payments of all the past non-paid employment entitlements, long service leave, annual leave. It might have been different leave loadings if the person you hired was working public holidays or something and perhaps should have been earning more based on an award or something. That will all be calculated for the period and you will be liable to repay that. If you have perhaps been a little bit more on the dodgy end of the scale and you have intentionally classified someone as a contractor and not an employee, that's termed sham contracting, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. If it's determined that that has come to pass, penalties and fines come into play as well. And also you just have general failure to maintain records through the ATO and a range of other bureaucratic arms of government who may want to also put up their hand and slap you on the wrist for not doing the right thing along the way. So the ramifications can be quite large for you as a business owner if you've got this wrong. If you've got this wrong, the ramifications are already large for the person that you hired, because they have potentially foregone a lot of entitlements that they otherwise should have been getting. Next slide, please, Carli. So sham contracting. This is the on the dodgier end of the scale. Sham contracting is not where someone innocently misclassifies the person they're hiring. This doesn't address the person that has spoken to an advisor, who has done the matrix, who has really thought about the scenario, has tried to draft things in a way that is beneficial to both parties. It doesn't address that. Sham contracting is really about those employers, those businesses who are trying to mask an employment arrangement by saying it's a contracting arrangement. They're doing the wrong thing, and usually they're doing it knowingly or with their head so far in the sand that they're being negligent. There's a few ways that this comes up. It can be where, and a very common one, and Carli, I'd be interested in your views on this one, is where perhaps a business has had someone working for them as an employee for a period of time. And then they've gone, hey, Tanya, you know what? Still want you as part of the team, but why don't you become a sole trader and we'll just contract with you that way? And because it'll be, you know, more tax advantageous or whatever it is. You're immediately trying to mask the relationship. The relationship is otherwise the same. I'm performing the same work for the same business on the same terms. So it's a sham. That's one really low-hanging fruit in the sham contracting world that people tend to do. Another one might be, and see this a little bit in certain industries, a little bit in my experience in some hospitality and in some construction, which will be where there's misrepresentations perhaps made. There might be a disjoin in bargaining power between the business and the person, the employee, and the business is saying, no, you're not allowed to be my employee. You have to get your own ABN. You have to invoice me. You have to do X, Y, and Z for whatever reason. Making those misrepresentations, using that sort of threatening behaviour, that's sham contracting as well. Sham contracting is taken very seriously. And so not only if you're found to have breached or, you know, the rule against sham contracting, not only do you need to repay all of those amounts that we spoke about in the previous slide, but you're also potentially liable for some significant penalties. Now, the penalties can range. If you're a company, it could be up to $66,000, $67,000 per instance. As an individual, it might be $14,000, $15,000 per circumstance. So it's not insignificant. Don't do it, is pretty much the long and the short of it. And I think Carli's with me on this one. You wouldn't be here listening to this presentation if you were thinking of doing it. If you hear of someone doing it, tell them not to do it. Essentially, it's not good.
We do get calls and someone will say, I've got someone who's an employee, can I make them a contractor? And my answer is just no.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes there's times when an employee might want to leave the organisation and you value their skills and they say to you, look, I'm happy to do a bit of work for you as a contractor. I'm going to start my own business. And look, that is legitimately contracting, but you also have to protect yourself. That evidence that Tanya was talking about, in those circumstances, I say, ask the employee to put that in writing to you as a request and respond to them in writing as a request. So it's very clear that that was done at their behest and not because you threatened them to become a contractor.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think too, even in that example, Carli, where perhaps the employees come saying, I've loved it here, it's great, but I want to start my own business. I'm happy to still provide my services to you, but I also want to be able to do so for other clients or do my own side hustle, whatever it is, right? to me, for the abundance of caution, I would really want to make sure that the scope of services that I'm getting that person to do by way of a contracting arrangement is quite different, or at least significantly narrower than that which they were doing in their 9-to-5 position, for example, as an employee.
And delivered differently. You know, they're not coming in and sitting in your office in the same way they were before. You know, there's a whole different way. And and I think that's what the sort of things that where people get themselves into trouble sometimes, is they actually are doing something that the employee has requested, but they don't consider that people are only happy until they're not. And when they're not, that's when they come back and you have to show you did the right thing.
Exactly. And I don't, you know, no doubt there's examples where this arises, as I said, you know, very innocently and what have you. The scenario we're talking about here is usually quite far down the track. You know, the cases that hit the headlines are where it's been a contracting arrangement that's been on foot for 7 years, 10 years, 13 years, and something else happens in that relationship. Something has soured that relationship for that employee, the hiree, to then look back and go, hang on, I think I'm entitled to something back here. Something else has arisen. So it goes to your point, Carli, that we're dealing with people, and naturally things come up. We run into impasses. We have disputes and things. So it may not sound great. And I know I sound like a big black hat lawyer when I'm like, get your evidence and keep it. But it's really important because we don't know what's down the track. But that's just my view. Now, this is really going to lawyer black hat land, but it does go to one's appetite for risk. I've been to leadership summits and things on this sort of topic, and I've heard quite a senior practitioner say that their baseline recommendation to business owners is an abundance of caution is, if you're not sure, hire them as an employee every time. And if the person that you're contracting with doesn't like that for whatever reason, find someone else to do it. And they're saying it is the safest option. Now, I think, sure, it's the safest option. It's probably not the most practical option out there, but that's really what we're talking about. Anything that's not a pure employment arrangement, you're starting to introduce different levels of risk, both in your contracting, so the document, and in the relationship. So just be aware that when you're moving away from a strict employment arrangement, you are entering a different realm of risk. I'm not saying that it's insurmountable or that you shouldn't go ahead with contracting arrangements, of course, but just be aware that it is riskier than a straight employment arrangement. So we might just then jump to, unless you had any comments about that, Carli.
I've got some I might add a bit later.
All right. We might then jump to what we need to include, or what we should be including in our independent contractor agreement. Now, this can take all different titles and forms. They can be a couple of pages, they can be 20 pages. It's up to you and your particular needs. Like all contracts, be very clear on the who, the what, the when, the how, and the how much, right? So all contracts, to be enforceable, they need to be clear. So be really clear on those things that are important to you. Who are you contracting with? What are you requiring them to do? How are you going to pay them? And when do they need to deliver? Ultimately, they're the 4 key ones that should apply for every single agreement and contract that you're entering. Where the independent contractor agreement then starts to become its own little beast is different provisions that we include and then talk to our client to make sure that it reflects reality, of course, but to address each of these limbs in the matrix that I spoke about before. So one might be control. You might see in an independent contractor agreement or services agreement, whatever you're calling it, a provision that says something like, whilst I, the business owner, maintain the right to direct you about the type of work to be done, or to give you deadlines or a general policy of customer service, whatever, you are ultimately in control of your work. I don't have control over your day-to-day work. You might see something with that sort of terminology. And you might sit there and go, oh, it seems a bit counterintuitive. You know, I'm the boss. I want them to do it my way. And that comes down to one of the major factors in this matrix that the ATO and Fair Work look at is, do you have control over this person? If you want the person that you're hiring to listen to your every direction, be here at that time, wear this, do it this way, speak that way, log out here, do this, blah, blah, blah. Very, very, ask me if you want to go to the tour, ask me if you want a day off, whatever it might be. If you want that level of control, that's fine, but they're more likely an employee. So start to explore an appropriate employment arrangement. If instead you're saying, look, I need X work done by the end of May, I prefer you did it from my premises, but I'm a bit flexible on that. And I'd like weekly check-ins or whatever it is, far less control. Now they're two extremes and there's a lot of, you know, opportunities in between. But one of the key factors is how much control do you as the business owner have over the person that's providing the work? Something we've got to look at practically and then document. Another provision that seems counterintuitive for a lot of these arrangements is a right to subcontract or a right to essentially novate or get someone else to do the work. So, excuse me, the example might be, I have a contract with Carli and the agreement says, Carli, I'm hiring you to prepare 17 contracts for me before the end of May. You have the right to subcontract that work to someone else. You sit there and go, that's weird. Like, you want Carli to do the work. And yes, I do. But the right to subcontract is, again, a really powerful indicator of what the relationship actually is. Now, I can put parameters around that right to subcontract. So it might say, yes, Carli, you can subcontract if you want. However, I have the right of refusal as to who that subcontractor is. They need to have the same level of experience. They need to have appropriate reputation. They need to hold the insurance or whatever it is, right, that's suitable for you and your circumstances. So you can put some parameters around it, but ultimately there is a right there. You might make it so difficult that they can never exercise it, but the right still exists. Indicator, contractor. Employees, we don't say you can subcontract. We say that, you know, they might have line staff or something, but they can't subcontract out. And so that's why it's an important indicator. Another important indicator of that you should document in the agreement, but then in reality will also come into play is who bears the risk if something goes wrong. So I've hired Carli to do the 17 agreements. End of May comes around and she thought I said 17 real estate agreements and instead I got 17 recipes, right? We've had a breakdown in communication, whatever it is. Oh, what do? Do I have to pay Carli again for another 17 agreements, or does she have to fix it because she got it wrong? Who bears the risk there? Now, it's a bit of a silly example, but the issue is who bears the risk. If it's the person doing the work that bears the risk to make good any issues, to rework, to fix defects, whatever it might be, then it's indicative of a contracting relationship. As we know, if we have employees and they stuff up, you know, they wreck something, whatever, you can't really ask them to pay to fix it. You might have performance management opportunities or things like that that you can work through, but you're not asking them to do defect rectification necessarily at their own risk. So it's another indicator. Another one, and this is, we're sort of getting into low-hanging fruit here, but do you require the person that you're hiring to wear your uniform, to use your premises, to use your tools, to only use your computer system, all those sorts of things? Now, depending on your circumstances, it may be impractical to allow them to do anything else, and that's fine. It's just one of a range of factors. But if in practice, I don't care what you wear, I don't care if you're using your laptop or mine or whatever, then maybe err on the side of mine's available if you want it, but also use yours. Again, it's that arm's length of I'm hiring you to get this done. I don't care how you get it done. Contractor. Intellectual property and other intangible assets. So this is like goodwill and reputation and things like that. Often they will be explicitly addressed in both employment agreements and contracting arrangements, can be subject to a little bit of difference depending on the contracting arrangement. Often an independent contractor, let's say we're talking someone in a creative field, and so we've hired someone to write some blogs for us or prepare logos or some branding or something for us. Often the contracting arrangement will say that, be very explicit about who owns that IP. Maybe the person that's doing the work for you will actually own it and we're just getting a license. If you've got something like that, that's really indicative of a contracting relationship versus employment, because often, and again, Carli will no doubt go into this either today or in another session, often in employment agreements, it will say, look, at the moment of creation, while you're on our time, any IP you create will immediately vest in me, the business owner. So it's just a slight distinction between the two. But the fact that you're turning your mind to it in your contracting arrangements is another indicator that you're intending it to be truly arm's length. Confidentiality, essentially the same across employment arrangements and contracting arrangements, with an exception that often you might be a little bit more explicit in an independent contractor agreement saying around who your contractor can share the information with and the like. Because if it's truly a contractor, they will probably have other clients. They will probably have other clients in a similar field to you, in a similar industry. They might be direct competitors. So your confidentiality provision could be far more detailed rather than a perhaps a more general one, which could appear in an employment agreement, which is you essentially agree to keep everything confidential that you find out on our time, is what it sort of comes down to in a nutshell. Non-compete is really can be an important determinant factor, or one of, is someone an employee or a contractor. If you've got an independent contracting agreement that says, Carli, you will do this work for me, for example, and you must not provide service to anyone else whilst my contract is on foot, full stop. I'm restricting your trade. I'm stopping you from being able to generate income from any other clients. I'm controlling you in a manner that is probably going to be outside the parameters of what is genuinely an independent contracting arrangement. Now, if I've got concerns about Carli being able to service my needs plus another at the same time, that's okay. And you can express those. You say, look, you can work for other people subject to my needs being met, essentially, subject to compliance with the confidentiality provisions, subject to whatever else might be applicable to your particular situation. But a holus bolus provision that says you must not work for anyone else, starting to sound a little bit more like an employment arrangement where you have that control over someone. When you come to pulling together an independent contractor agreement yourself, or hopefully with some form of advice or a well worked up template that you're obtaining somewhere, please remember that it's more than what's written on the bit of paper. That only gets you so far. It has to reflect reality. So if you're saying in the contract, you can do your own thing, I don't have control, yeah, you can subcontract, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, you are watching this person like a hawk, you're monitoring them, you're whatever it might be that's inconsistent with the contract, that will be taken into consideration. So remember that it is the reality of the situation that will inform a lot of these decisions, not the dusty old bit of paper that's been in the bottom drawer for the 5 years since that you entered it.
There's a great case I saw in 2020 where the judge said if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. You know,
yep.
It doesn't matter what the piece of paper says. If in reality, particularly when you have employees and contractors, if you can't differentiate them other than the way they're paid, that's a problem.
And I think it's also important to not do a set and forget. You know, day one, here I am sitting here now. Yes, it might be an independent contracting agreement, but as we develop in 2 years' time, we may no longer be truly an independent contracting relationship. Maybe we've morphed into more of an employment arrangement. So do you diarise? Do you sit down with your table of trusted advisors once a year or whatever it is and sit there and go, oh, is Carli still an independent contractor? Shit. You know, we've invited her to every Christmas party. She's in there at every meeting. She's wearing our uniform. She's rocking up with everyone else. Like, does that still hold true, or do we need to reclassify? Do we need to call her in and let's sort of have a chat about this? So it's probably, you know, day one stuff, but then keep checking in. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are some really great free resources out there for you to do some additional thinking and poking around and research and really get on top of it. The Fair Work website naturally has the most amount of information, and it goes into, and it's very handy for what Carli's going to talk about too. It does talk a lot about sham contracting, and it does talk about the matrix. businessvic.gov.au is an awesome site. I find it really handy. A lot of the government websites are a bit clunky and you're not necessarily intuitive to find your way around. I think the Victorian government have done a really good job with this one. It's intuitive. There's graphics and videos for different types of learners and thinkers, and they've got a lot of great information around contracting and what to look out for, where to go for additional help. And then, of course, the ATO has the matrix, as does Fair Work. Also, if you just did general Google searches on a couple of other things, superannuation, it'll tell you based on your circumstances, your industry, and the type of work your hirer is doing for you, whether you are obliged to make the super contribution payments on their behalf. With that one, have a chat to your bookkeeper, have a chat to your accountant, have a chat to your legal advisors, HR advisors. You don't want to get that one wrong.
Yeah, I like to say that always remember that Fair Work and the ATO, whilst they have a lot of similarities, there are some differences, because one is about how much money they can claim from you, and that's their motivation, and the other one is about protecting the rights of employees.
Absolutely.
So there are times that someone will just go to the ATO site and they'll say, this is what it said. I'm like, yes, that's fine, but you're not taking into consideration what Fair Work thinks. Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot to be said for gut as well, Carli.
Yeah,
if it just doesn't feel right, ask someone.
You're the stronger party as the employer. That's something we say a lot, is you have to remember you are making these decisions. You are the stronger party. So, you know, if you're erring in your favour and not the employees, then it's probably going to be against you down the track if it's ever questioned.
Yeah, 100%. So that's it from me. Here's how you can contact me in all of these little areas. Reach out anytime. I also, I do a free 15-minute call and things. So if you've got any just little questions on the back of this or otherwise, feel free to reach out and we can have a chat. If I can't help, I'll flick you to Carli or someone else, and we'll work it out together. But you're well advised to have these chats up front, or the second that you start to get that little bit of anxiety around, I don't know that I'm doing the right thing, pick up the phone to someone and just double check.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tanya, for that. That was really fantastic.
Welcome.
And so now I am going to jump into the employment realm. And it's funny, we tend to see that there's sort of, one of the things we see that's very common is someone says, I've got someone who I want to employ, they want to be a contractor. And I always say, well, you're asking the wrong question, because it's about all the things that you've just spoken about. It's not about what they want or you want. It's about the actual nature of the relationship. And, you know, there will be some people in some industries that have probably traditionally been very contractor focused, will have that expectation. But, you know, I always come back to a conversation around control. Do you want a team that you're going to manage and grow together and control and build? Do you want to have people that are going to come in and do the work and leave? Again, depending on the industry. And, you know, coming back to my comment about everyone's happy till they're not, it's often when you terminate someone that they suddenly want to make an unfair dismissal claim against you. Yeah. So that's when they suddenly want to be an employee. And often, unfortunately, they're probably in the right. So we do work with a lot of businesses that are in that position where they've maybe traditionally had those contractors and starting to realise that they need to transition. And so that's something that we quite commonly do. I'm going to start by just really briefly touching on the laws that govern employment, because I think it's always a good place to start, because like some of the resources that Tanya's put up, these are the places you go to find the information you need around employment. So all employment in Australia is underpinned by the Fair Work Act and the National Employment Standards, which set out the minimum requirements for employees right across the board. Whether you're award-free or under an award, everybody is covered by the National Employment Standards. The next layer in our system is the industrial instrument. Now, in most cases, that will be an award. It may be an enterprise agreement for some businesses as well. And look, some either professions or industries can be award-free, but generally, this is the next layer of detail. So while the NES covers off our leave entitlements, minimum entitlements on termination, things like that, the award or enterprise agreement starts to get into either industry or profession specific detail about span of hours and different classifications and minimum wages and things like that. So you need to understand those things because you are legally obligated to meet them. The third layer is the employment agreement. And I'll be honest, technically speaking, if you are only going to pay exactly what's in an award, you don't necessarily have to have a written agreement. However, it's also not going to cover you to a lot of those things Tanya touched on about like intellectual property and confidentiality. There is a whole realm of other things that is really important to have in an employment agreement. And it's really important to note that the employment agreement or employment contract can't be, you can't contract out of the minimum entitlements in the two layers below. You have to be, you can certainly pay above and offset things, but you have to be at or better than the employee would have been if they were getting their minimum entitlements. And I'll touch on that a little bit. So we talked about employers or contractors. Employees can be full-time, part-time, casual, they can be apprentices or trainees. They receive payment for their time as wages and salary. They have tax taken out by their employer, and they can be directed when, where, how to do and complete a task. All of the opposite of the things that Tanya spoke about as a contractor. And believe me, I've seen many examples of when people get it wrong and what they assume. And I really like what you said at the end there about not setting and forgetting, because I think that's something that's so important, because there's two ways people get in trouble with contractors, in my opinion, and it's the same with casuals. They start as a true contractor or casual, and then over time they morph and no one's gone back and checked, and suddenly you're not doing the right thing anymore. The other way is they should never have been it in the first place. So, it is really important you don't set and forget. So full-time employment is generally 38 hours a week. Whoever the genius was that decided 38 hours over 5 days was the great way to set up our hours. I'd like to thank them for all the issues they've caused over the years. And look, 37.5 hours is still considered full-time employment if you want to go 7.5 hours a day for ease. The exact hours of work that determine full-time employment are generally usually set out in an award and the employment contract. If you're full-time, you're entitled to benefits such as sick leave and annual leave, minimum notice periods for termination, redundancy, flexible working hours, overtime pay for working outside of regular hours for some employees. And it can be permanent or fixed term. I'll just briefly say with fixed term, there's nothing wrong with a fixed term contract. And even renewing a fixed term contract once, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as there's a good reason. But what you can't do is have someone on a 12-month fixed term contract that they've been on for 8 years and every 12 months you've just renewed it. They're never going to be considered a fixed term contract. They will always be considered permanent. Part-time is essentially exactly the same as full-time, other than the fact that they're contracted for less than 38 hours a week. So the entitlements is the same, but generally on a pro rata basis. So if you work 3 days a week, you're entitled to accrue leave on the 3 days a week and the hours that you actually work. There are sometimes minimum hours per shift that are set in industrial instruments. So for example, a part-timer under some awards may have to work at least 8 hours a week, or they may have to work at least 3 hours per shift and nothing less. It's really important to understand that, what industrial instrument you're covered by, so you can check these things. And they can be, again, permanent or on a fixed term contract. I was talking to a client today about a parental leave coverage contract. It's a great example of when a fixed term contract comes into play. Someone is going away for 6 months, they're going on leave of some type, and you want someone to come in and do that job for that period and still have the option to extend them at the end or offer them permanent employment. But if that other employee is coming back, they know there's an end date. Now, unless specified within the industrial instrument you're covered by, part-time employees are generally entitled to penalty rates for working additional hours. It's something we see people get wrong all the time. They have might be an allied health clinic, and they have 4 admin staff that are all part-time, and someone goes on leave and everyone takes on an extra shift. Everybody's happy about the arrangement, but those extra hours are actually entitled to be paid at penalty rates, unless you have an offset clause and you pay well above the award and all those sort of things. And generally in those roles you don't. And I think it's those unintentional things that people can sometimes get wrong. There are some awards, such as the restaurant award, that you can be paid at your ordinary rate up to 38 hours, but there's only a handful of awards that actually have that in there. So it's very important you read this if you do have in your industrial instrument, if you have part-time employees. So generally speaking, before commencing employment, employers and employees should agree in writing the regular pattern of work someone is going to work. So the number of hours each week, the days of the week they'll work, their starting and finishing times. We often see clients go, oh, you know, we'll say, well, what are the hours they work? Oh, well, they work this many hours a week. Well, what days and times? I don't know. How do we know when penalty rates are going to apply? How do we know, you know, some of these things? And my favourite is, oh, there was a public holiday. Do I have to pay them? Well, do they normally work that day? I don't know. We saw this a lot when COVID hit in 2020, and a lot of people very quickly made changes to people's hours, but didn't document the days that they would be working. And all of a sudden we had Easter and all these public holidays, and it caused a bit of pain. So any changes you want to make to your part-time hours should be made in writing, and it can be mutually agreed, and it happens all the time. I mean, my staff like to joke that they started off working 15 hours a week, and then I was 20 and then 25. You know, the business is growing, and as long as it's agreed, that's fine, but you should always document it in writing, because if you've got an agreement that documents someone's on 20 hours a week and they're now working 30, those 10 hours are technically overtime, and you may be underpaying them if you haven't made the change. Casual employment is it should be working irregular hours and days. They are not entitled to any forms of paid leave. They're not required to provide statutory notice for termination. They may be, again, entitled to a minimum number of hours per shift. There doesn't have to be a commitment in advance of how long they'll be employed for, the days or hours they work. Often we get people that want to write into a casual employment agreement the exact times people are going to work. And I'm like, no, we don't want to do that, because they are casuals. You don't have to offer them those hours. And they also don't have to commit to all the work that you might offer them. They're actually able to refuse work. So it's really, and I guess we talk about contractors versus employees. The next one we deal with is casual versus part-time. There's been some changes around casuals recently, and this table was put together before those changes came into place, but I still think it's a really good table. And these are the sort of things we were getting at with that long-term arrangement with someone who's either a casual or a contractor, is that it can morph over time. So, you know, if someone's work times and days are changing all the time, and there's a high degree of flexibility, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, they're really a true true casual. The longer someone works for you and the more they work a regular pattern of hours, the more likely they are to start to morph into being more like a permanent employee. And so the longer that goes on, the more regular that is. And that's what I mean. If someone started with you, well, I once had a trade-based business say, I've got 5 employees, they're all casual and they work 38 hours a week. They were never casuals. They were all full-time employees. It didn't matter how they were paid. They were never going to be seen that way. But it's that don't set and forget. You don't want to put yourself at risk there. But you can also have long-term casuals. It is really common in some industries to have people that have worked as a true casual very long-term. But it is also always good practice if someone's been with you a while and they're working regular hours to have those conversations. Check in with them about whether they want permanent employment. They may not want it. Put it to them in writing still. You still want to cover and show that you've had those conversations. A long-term casual will have entitlements, and if JobKeeper and the pandemic taught us anything, it's that suddenly people realised that there are definitions around these things. And I had some people who were happy that they got JobKeeper for their long-term casuals. I'm like, yes, but now they've been designated long-term casuals and other things might come into play now. So they will receive additional entitlements, such as being able to request some more flexible working arrangements, being able to take parental leave. These things start to kick in. Long service leave will apply for long-term casuals that meet certain criteria. And, you know, it's a little bit similar to contractors. Someone might have been really happy to be a casual until suddenly you terminate them like they're a casual. And you say, well, I'm just not going to give you any more shifts. And suddenly they should have been permanent. And that's where they're going to Fair Work to try and get unfair dismissal and back payment and lots of other things. So it is really important to be clear. Once you're clear it's employment, be clear on the type of employment. And we do get people when we start with them and do an audit that say, oh, they're part-time casual. And my response is generally, you can't be half pregnant. You've got to be one or the other. They are not the same thing. They're not interchangeable. And we do hear the same things with employees and contractors. People think that they're interchangeable, but they're really not. So I just wanted to cover a few little myths and mistakes that we see people make around employment. Treating a part-time employee like a casual is a big one. So what I was talking about before, when you've got a part-timer and, you know, you offer them extra hours here and there and you don't put it in writing, you don't make an agreement, they're happy, you're happy, but you may be underpaying them because they are entitled to overtime for that extra time. We once did a test on a particular employee who was contracted for 10 hours a week, but they're now working 19 hours a week. Their contract was never changed. They were paid well above the award, but technically speaking, they were entitled to 2 hours of time and a half and 5 hours of double time. So they were actually technically being underpaid. So they're the sort of things that can grab you. And these arrangements do change over time. All arrangements change over time. People take on more hours. The thing is to document it. And look, it doesn't always have to be a formal contract as long as there's something in writing that demonstrates there was an agreement. And the other thing we do sometimes is that there might be a temporary change. So a great example we've got with that is university students that often work in allied health practices, in reception during the school terms. They work part-time, and then over Christmas they work full-time for a period of 3 months. So we do a variation just letter that says effective from this date to this date, they are now going to work full-time hours. Effective from that end date, they will revert back to their previous hours. And they sign it and agree to it. So it's really clear that there is a documented path on how things changed. So anytime you vary contracted hours, whether it's a full-timer going to part-time or a part-time going to full-time or a part-timer changing their hours, it can only be through consultation and mutual agreement. Now, consultation doesn't mean you sat down and told the employee it was happening and they had no choice but to accept. They have to genuinely want to accept. So, I mean, I've done it with a number of my team. I've sat down and said, would you be interested in more hours? In fact, I do that at the start of every year with my part-timers because everybody's a mum, kids change and things change, and we sit down at the start of every year and look at everyone's days and hours and see what's works, because we can do that in our business. But we document it and we make the changes so it's really clear for everybody. Those changes should be mutually agreed. And again, if you've got an employee who's coming to you and requesting it, ask them to request in writing so that you've got that trail. And all variations must remain within the scope of the industrial instrument. So if you've suddenly got someone who takes on a Saturday and you're paying them above award, and so it covers a little bit of overtime, suddenly working on a Saturday may not now cover that with what you're paying above the award. So you've got to be a little careful with that, and always confirm in writing and have them sign to say that they've accepted it. Now, one of my favourites, I pay way above the award, it doesn't apply to me. Just because you pay high wages does not mean that award does not apply in your business. Awards apply based on profession and they apply based on industry. Now, there are award-free roles, and, you know, particularly when someone becomes, even in some awards, because someone's in a management position doesn't make them award-free. So you really need to be clear on this. The high wage threshold, the high income threshold that excludes someone from the unfair dismissal realm is nearly $160,000 a year. It's very rare that in small businesses someone is on more than that. So again, these are the assumptions people make. They go, oh, but I pay so much, it doesn't matter. Well, it actually does, because there could be clauses in that award. You may be paying them correctly, but there may be other things that apply that you're not aware of. I was literally looking at an award this morning on an issue like that. I asked them which award they were covered by, and they sent me to, they said, oh, it's either the clerical or this one. I said, well, again, it can't be both. It's got to be one or the other. And they had very different ways that they structured benefits and entitlements. Another one we hear a lot is my employees are all on an annualised salary. That's fantastic. So what are they on per hour? Oh, I don't know. We just pay them the same thing every week. Great. When's the last time you checked that salary is actually correct and covered everything? So since July 2018, so in the last 4 years, there's been a 10.75% increase to the minimum wage and award rates. So during that time, if you set and forget, suddenly you could find, well, your employee's gone up 2 classifications in the award because you haven't bothered to look at that. Their roles changed some, and now they're entitled to a couple of levels above. Their hours and days of work have changed. They're now working a Saturday. And suddenly the annualised salary you calculated at the beginning that would have more than covered, overtime and other things no longer does. And another thing we hear a lot is, oh, but they don't have to do a timesheet because they're annualised salary. How will you prove, if they're not doing a timesheet, how can you prove they were paid correctly for the hours they worked? Because you've got no record of their hours. It's one of those myths that's perpetuated itself over the years. And if someone is particularly covered by an award, just do a timesheet. Maybe they're doing the same times every week, it doesn't matter, but they generally don't. And you've got no way of proving when someone comes back to you, the burden of proof is on you to prove you paid them correctly, not on them to prove you didn't. So they're the main things I'm going to cover. Like, I just wanted to do a bit of a snapshot. Today was a lot more about the contracting for me. So I find that's probably the area. And we did cover in our last webinar a couple of those topics on employment. Our next one we're going to cover in May is about leave entitlements and all the frequently asked questions we get on leave, because it is something that, again, every week we have questions come up on leave. And often it's because you haven't had to deal with the type of leave before. You've never dealt with long service leave before. You've never dealt with parental leave before. So we're going to cover that at our next webinar in May. And certainly we'll send you out a link in advance as someone who's attended this particular session. There's all our details to follow. Similar to with Cross the T, we're on all the different platforms, and we have a newsletter that we have that you can sign up for and get updates on things that are happening. There's been some changes to the SCADS award, for example, so we'll be putting that in our next newsletter. We're also going to be covering vaping in the workplace because I've had a few issues come up on that. Hint, it's the same as smoking, but people think of it as being different. But I encourage you to go and follow us. And, I would say we're probably more serious on the top 2. And the third one, if you want to see some funny memes about work, we try and compete in the background as staff on putting some funny memes through. So I'd like to open it up for questions. If anybody who is online would like to throw any questions in the chat box or the Q&A, Tanya and I are more than happy to answer any specific questions that you might have. I probably should have said at the start, if you have them as you go along, put them in, but I always forget those things. And look, it's hard sometimes, I think, because it is very specific to your workplace and your situation to ask the questions. So if there's nothing anyone wants to ask specifically of us right now to cover, we're both more than happy to have a chat. Both of our contact details will be in the recording when we send them out. Oh, we've got one. Fantastic. If you pay above award wages, and this covers the overtime rate, do you need to accommodate this? So if you pay above award wages and you have checked and done what's referred to as a better off overall test, which is essentially saying for the hours that employee is working, have you, with what they would have received under the award for working those hours with all the penalty rates and the minimum wage, is what you're paying now at or above that? The answer is yes, then you're paying correctly. But you should have what we refer to as an offset clause in your employment agreement that states, to the extent someone is paid above the award, that is used to offset those entitlements under the award. So you can absolutely do it, but always check it. And second, always make sure that you have that offset clause that states that it is covering it. Melissa, we have a carpentry contractor who don't want to be employees for flexibility of time off and extra leave. How do I manage this, as it sounds like they need to be an employee? I guess it can be quite tricky, and we see this a lot. I always think as a business, and Tanya, please jump in if you want to, as a business, you need to decide what you want. You need to sit back and go, if I know these are employees, I can't continue to hire them as contractors. I have worked particularly with trades where, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Tanya, but I've been advised in the past that if they're a proprietary limited company and you're a proprietary limited company, that significantly reduces the risk. So we've been in situations where we've worked with trades where they've said, okay, say you're at this time of the year, as of the 1st of July, we are only going to have subcontractors that are proprietary limited companies. Otherwise, we're happy to have you come across as an employee. Here's what that will look like. Go and talk to your accountant, go and weigh up the pros and cons, go home and talk to your wife, and give them time to think about it, have those discussions. But you as the employer have put a pretty firm line in the sand that it's not going to be, you're not going to be held hostage to them, you know, I'll go. But if you know that they should be employees, and often it's really common in those sort of industries because people, that's what they want because their mates do it. And I often say just because so-and-so's doing it doesn't mean it's actually correct.
And Carli, I might just add there, and this is probably a bit of an extension and outside the parameters of what we're talking about here, but using that example where we've got perhaps a trade and you're saying, look, sure, go out and get your own Pty Ltd company because it does help a bit because it's company contracting with company. And then that company gets to allocate which of its own employees does particular work. So it may turn out that it's the same employee that used to work for you, or it may not. And so, you know, that level of control is reduced. What I would say there is, if you're this original business, just have a think about some of your original contracting arrangements with your clients. Perhaps you do some trade work with local government or with some of the bigger boys in town, your John Hollands or whatever, that you may already be signed up to some restrictions on who you can subcontract work to. And so by you helping out one of your workers to sort of, you know, give them the flexibility they're looking like, and yeah, I'll subcontract to you, that's great, you're looking after them, but are you causing yourself some problems with your own client base? It's not insurmountable, but it's just something to be aware of when you're entering these arrangements.
And that's why we've got you on here today, because they're the sort of things that, they're the questions that we send off to you because they're outside the realm. We specialise in employment, so we answer those questions.
Absolutely. And look, none of what we're talking about, Carli, is in isolation or is in a vacuum, is it? Every single thing touches on something else. And it's, and this, and what about this? And that's why talking about specific situations, it's really important. And we have clients that have a good mix of employees and contractors and works quite successfully for them. And it's because they've got the clear distinction and they're, you know, they've really thought about it. It's often when you first start to realise that, oh, maybe we're not doing things, we're doing things how the industry's done them, not how they probably should be done, that often you have to start making those decisions. And you may have to, at some point as a business owner, make a decision which is, I'm willing to lose this person because I'm not willing to take the risk of having that on. And sometimes, you know, they might leave and they might go, and, you know, that might be a risk that you are taking, but ultimately you're reducing the risk to your business. Yeah. Thank you for those two questions. They're great. Is there any other questions that anyone would like to add in? We'd be more than happy to answer them now. But if there's no more questions, then I'm happy to sort of wrap us up for the evening. Thank you so much for joining me today, Tanya. I really appreciate it. I am sure we'll come up with another topic we can get you involved with down the track. I will also say we touched on a few questions there around the award rates. And so our June webinar will also be as we lead into the new increase in the minimum wage that usually comes in on the 1st of July. In June, we're actually going to run a session that's all about how to make sure you don't run into any trouble through that. So that will be a topic we've got coming up as well. And as we've both said, if there's any questions that you have, please feel free to reach out. Probably in the next 48 hours, I'll be sending through a recording of this to everybody who has registered for today or attended, and also some information on Tanya and how you can contact her. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for having me along, Carli. Much appreciated.
Excellent.
And everyone, yeah, please do drop me an email or reach out through socials or whatever works for you. I'm here to help wherever I can.
Fantastic. And I hope everyone got to sort of enjoy a bit of a glass of wine while they sat back and watched this of an evening, a bit more relaxed than when you're in the middle of a busy work day. And so we're going to continue to run these of an evening because I think it does make it a little easier for some of us that run businesses. And Tanya and I both run our own business as well and have families and have to juggle everything. I'm really excited that this time my dogs and kids did not make any noise in the background. So that was a bonus. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening, and thank you all for joining us today.